So let's take a look at the gas laws, the diffusion principles, and gas exchange. Basically what we're going to do is we're going to look at why gases are going to move in the direction that they do. The first law we have to look at is Boyle's law. Boyle's law tells us that there's an inverse relationship between the volume that a gas displaces and the pressure that the gas has on the walls of a container. The general rule here is as pressure increases, volume decreases, and as volume increases, pressure decreases, and that's for an equal molar quantity of gas. Edmonton's and Charles's law is going to tell us that the volume that the gas occupies is proportional to its temperature, which is proportional to the pressure, which is inverse to the density of the gas on the walls of a container. The general rule, warmer gas will exert more pressure as it takes up more volume. Colder gas will become more dense and take up less volume, thereby producing less pressure. The next law is Dalton's law. Dalton's law tells us that each gas in a mixture of gases exerts its own pressure, where the pressure of a specific gas is the partial pressure of that gas within the total. We can look at, say, the atmosphere of 760 millimeters of mercury is going to be comprised of the partial pressure of nitrogen plus the partial pressure of oxygen plus the partial pressure of water plus the partial pressure of carbon dioxide plus the partial pressure of all other gases in the atmosphere. The general rule here is that partial pressure of the gas is the percentage of the air made up by that gas, and that partial pressures of the gas within the atmosphere is constantly changing. This is one of the reasons why in areas where you have high human activity, the partial pressure of other gases will change drastically throughout the day as it displaces the partial pressure of oxygen within that area. And it's one of the reasons why if you're an outdoor exerciser, you want to exercise earlier in the day as opposed to later in the day in areas of high human activity. So let's take a look at this concept. Well, the partial pressure of nitrogen is based off of the fact that 78% of all pressure in the atmosphere comes from nitrogen. So we have 597.4 millimeters of mercury pressure from nitrogen. Oxygen at 20.9 gives us 158.8. Water at 004 gives us 3. Carbon dioxide at 0004 gives us 0.3. And then all other gases at 0006 gives us 0.5 millimeters of mercury pressure. It's the change that we see with the other gases relative to the change in either nitrogen, oxygen, or carbon dioxide that's going to impact ventilatory gas exchange, as it's going to change how much of the other gases will be available for diffusion to occur. The other thing that happens is that the partial pressure of the gases do not change as we go up in elevation. However, the total pressure decreases. Because the total pressure decreases, we get a relative change in the amount of pressure exerted by each of the gases. It's one of the reasons why it becomes more difficult to breathe at higher elevations. Dalton's law is also going to help us explain the diffusion of gases at the alveoli, where the diffusion of gas across the permeable membrane is going to be from areas of high partial pressure to areas of low partial pressure. The greater the difference, the faster the rate of diffusion. Where atmospheric conditions will influence the ventilation based off of environmental conditions, such as what gases are available within the atmosphere, the time of the day, and the time of the year, as time of day and time of year will greatly impact the temperatures that we have to look at. Henry's law tells us that the quantity of a gas that is dissolved in a liquid is proportional to the partial pressures of the gases and its solubility. Carbon dioxide is 24 times more soluble than oxygen in water. And what we have to remember is that plasma is 95% water, which means that we have much more carbon dioxide dissolved in the blood. The solubility differences that we see is the reason why we have chemoreceptors that are sensitive to carbon dioxide and not oxygen. Additionally, higher partial pressures of gas over a liquid leads to higher solubility. The higher partial pressure, the more soluble the gas will be within the solution. As gases encounter lower partial pressures on the opposite side of the membrane, they're going to come out of solution. It's these gases that come out of solution that will diffuse across the membranes. But it's not just with diffusion across the membranes. It's also about gases within the plasma itself. It's one of the issues that scuba divers have to worry about, as well as high altitude flights have to worry about, in terms of keeping gases dissolved within the solution. As the scuba diver comes up from depth, or as the high altitude pilot goes up into altitude, the gases are going to be more likely to come out of solution, which is why we have pressure suits for high altitude aviators and why scuba divers do staged ascents. What this does is this allows for equilibriums to be kept and gases to remain within the solution. The last law we have to look at is Fick's law. Fick's law is not a gas law, but it's a diffusion principle. And what it tells us is that the rate of diffusion is proportional to the partial pressure differences across the membrane with the total surface area of interaction, the diffusion constant of the gas, and is inversely proportional to the distance or the thickness that the gas has to diffuse through. And so we simply say that the change of volume, that is how much is diffusing, is equal to the total surface area times the diffusion constant times the change in partial pressure across the membrane over the distance of diffusion. We can simplify this to simply state that the rate of diffusion is inversely proportional to the thickness and directly proportional to the change in concentrations, where the change of volume, the amount diffusing, is equal to the change in concentrations from one side of the membrane to the other side of the membrane over the total distance of diffusion. Fick's law is what's going to govern the structure as well as the Fick's law is going to govern the direction that gases will move and the reason for having the large surface areas that we see in areas that we have diffusions occurring. So what's going to govern the rate of pulmonary gas exchange? Well, it's going to depend on, first, Boyle's law regarding the difference between atmospheric pressure and lung pressures, the surface area that we allow for gas exchange to occur, the molecular weight, that is how big the gases happen to be, and the solubility of the gases to get in and out of solution, the partial pressure of the gases across the membrane, or the ability to keep them in or out of solution, as well as components of Fick's law, concentration or partial pressures of gases and the distance over which diffusion has to take place, based off of Dalton's and Fick's, as well as a couple other gas laws, along with the pressure differentials driving the gases between the body and the environment. So gas exchange is going to be continuous. It's going to be continuous through the alveoli, in between the alveoli and the pulmonary capillaries, where we're going to constantly be moving from high pressure to low pressure in a countercurrent mechanism until we get equal pressures on both sides of the membrane, where the net is going to be carbon dioxide out and oxygen in terms of the gases that we're wanting to look at. Oxygen is going to diffuse until we get about 100 millimeter mercury pressure. Carbon dioxide will diffuse until we get about a 40 millimeter mercury pressure in terms of equilibrium. Once we get into the system, how is it going to be transported? Well, transportation is going to be dependent upon Henry's law, which is going to indicate that the most likely to dissolve in the solution will be found in the plasma, whereas the least likely will be found bound to a carrier molecule. Dalton's law is going to indicate that we have bulk flow within the system that's based off of the change in rate of diffusion at interaction points, which means that even though we're moving in bulk flow, individual gases will move in individual directions at distinct locations. This is where we'll have oxygen moving out of capillary beds into tissues and carbon dioxide moving from tissues into capillary beds. The movement is going to be based off of, can I get in or out of solution, which is dictated on Henry's law. Then we have Charles's law, which tells us that the overall capacity to hold gases in solution is going to be dependent upon the relative temperature of the plasma. So if we think about it, the warmer the plasma is, the more gases we can cram into that solution. The colder the gas is, the less we can cram into that solution. As we warm up gases, we're going to have more oxygen found in the plasma and less oxygen found bound to hemoglobin. Whereas the colder the plasma, the less oxygen we're going to find in the plasma and the more oxygen we're going to find bound to hemoglobin. So let's take a look at the way in which gases are going to move, in particular carbon dioxide and oxygen, within the two ventilation cycles, the external ventilation cycle between the alveoli and the atmosphere, and then the internal ventilation cycle in between the alveoli and capillaries and tissues. So we have exchange in which we have oxygen moving from the atmosphere into the alveoli, and then from the alveoli into the capillaries. Then we have movement of oxygen from the capillaries to the tissues, while we have movement of carbon dioxide from the tissues to the capillaries, and then from the capillaries to the alveoli, and then alveoli into the atmosphere. In this movement, we have to remember is that oxygen is going to have about 1.5% of its entirety dissolved within the plasma based off of solubility principles, which means that 98.5% is going to be constantly bound to the erythrocytes, the RBCs. This is based off of the hemoglobin being able to contain oxygen at the 4 iron atoms within each molecule, and the affinity that the hemoglobin will have for the oxygen within transportation. So if we look at it, even though we have the direction of motion that we already looked at, what we have to remember is that 1.5% of all oxygen will be bound to the hemoglobin both on the arterial side as well as on the venal side. It's that 1.5% of dissolved oxygen that will be able to diffuse. It is not the bound oxygen that will be able to diffuse. As it relates to carbon dioxide, about 7% is dissolved. It's that 7% that's dissolved that will be diffusing. 23% will be bound to hemoglobin. The other 70% make up the bicarbonate molecule, the molecule that's involved in regulation of ventilation, and can dissociate into its alkalinic form to act as a buffer. It's the buffer that will increase when we have to worry about the metabolic phase of the triphasic response. Now, these gas laws are going to be impacted based off of anatomical changes that occur with diseases. In particular, we're going to see changes in compliance and in changes of diffusion. In upper respiratory diseases, we're going to see a change of compliance. Upper respiratory diseases include things like asthma, sinusitis, laryngitis, where we're either increasing the viscosity of the motion or we're decreasing the diameter of the lumen. Where the lower respiratory diseases, the chronic bronchitis, the quote-unquote smoker's lungs, or the COPD issues, are issues where the alveoli lose their structural integrity or increase the distance upon which diffusion must occur. In this case here, we alter Fick's law, meaning that we're going to slow down the rate of diffusion that we see with the gases.